When this series was being planned, just under a year ago, very few of us had actually heard of the silicon chip, except for some doom-laden media forecasts suggesting that it was yet another devilish invention whose only impact would be to create widespread social disaster and panic. Dr. Christopher Evans, who died just before we completed these films, was a leading figure in world computer technology. He was a scientist and was deeply involved in the psychological implications of the changes the microprocessor will inevitably bring. He felt passionately that this second industrial revolution will ultimately lead to a more affluent society, but more important, that it will create a climate of far greater social awareness, where in the future, mankind, freed from the drudgery of mass-producing goods, will begin to learn more about his world and its people. In this, the last program, 4 people centrally involved with the computer revolution will discuss some of these issues. We hope the points they raise reflect those you may have questioned on seeing these films. Born in England, but now with Virginia Polytechnic in America, Professor Jack Good was one of the team which cracked the German Enigma code in the Second World War. A world figure in large-scale digital computer design, he originated the concept of the ultra-intelligent machine, which he feels will eventually cope with every intellectual activity as well as any human being. James Martin is one of the world's leading experts on database and telecommunications systems, and he organizes international seminars on this theme. His latest book, The Wired Society, examines the social implications of the computer revolution when coupled with rapidly increasing satellite communications. With a strong economic background, Barry Sherman has co-authored several books with Clive Jenkins on the effects the computer revolution will have on our patterns of work. He's the Director of Research at the Association of Scientific, Technical and Managerial Staffs in London. Professor Tom Stonier holds the founding chair in Science and Society at Bradford University. His main concern is the interaction between science, society and technology, and he's a consultant to many international organizations.
We've got a very, very deeply ingrained work ethic, Protestant ethic in Britain. If you ask a person in the street, what are you? They won't say I'm kind of a man, 5'6" and a chrysanthemum grower. They will say, well, I'm a joiner, I'm a carpenter, I'm a milkman. They identify with work. There is an identity in a job. So when people become unemployed and don't work, they tend to lose their identity. So you've got a financial penalty, but you've also got this very, very big psychological penalty. People feel they're not complete if they're not working. Now, frankly, that is going to have to change.
At the moment, we're still worried about getting enough money to pay for sustaining the physical aspects of society. That actually is going to disappear very rapidly. As a matter of fact, in 30 years from now, I would expect no more than 10% of the labor force to be engaged in materials production. The other 90% will be engaged in essentially services, predominantly in jobs which relate people to people. Education, health, enormous number in health care and other social services and leisure industry and so forth.
The most important thing about this technology is that we actually use it. We need to use it. We must use it. Now, there are forces at work which suggest that if we play the game wrong, we won't use it. It'll be choked off. It'll be a stillborn industrial revolution. And those forces are basically, if, firstly, managers in Britain don't accept the idea that that technology is there to be used. Secondly, they try to introduce it in a way in which unions will be almost forced to actually say, no, we don't want it. And thirdly, if governments insist on saying, look, if you're unemployed, tough luck.
The same microelectronics industry has the capability to create an infinite array of new products. The number of new business opportunities now are greater than ever before. And if things go well in the 1980s, I think one of the patterns you can see building up now is there's more capability for an intelligent, young, aggressive person to become a millionaire in the 1980s than ever before in history, because there are so many new products that are needed and that he can create.
British managers are conservative with a small c. They don't like taking risks. They're not paid enough to take risks. And frankly, even if they do take a risk and it succeeds, the senior management get all the credit. And if they take a risk and it fails, rather unlike America or Germany or France or Japan, if it fails, they get the boot. So it doesn't pay them to actually take the risk, to bring in a new product, to bring in a new component, to bring in a new process. So the first thing we've got to do is actually make managers take those sort of decisions.
The rate at which we create new jobs, in my opinion, is going to depend upon the number of entrepreneurs in society. And so absolutely the worst thing that a country could do is to drive out its entrepreneurs. And as you look around the world today, as I travel the globe today, it's quite clear to me that some countries have been driving out their entrepreneurs. And that is very dangerous socially for the 1980s.
Within the next 5 years, we should see the working week down to a minimum of 38 hours standard. And hopefully also with some sort of bar on overtime as well. And it won't only be Britain, it'll be almost every single West European country doing the same thing at the same time. Within 10 years, I would think that would be down to 35 or less hours. And certainly within 15, 20 years, that will need to be down to something like 21, 20 hours. Very low. Also, we shouldn't really think in terms of hours. We should think in terms of trips to work, which is the number of days that you work a week, not the number of hours. So people will be going for 3-day weeks, 2-day weeks, 5-day weekends. That'll be the answer. One of the factors that will hit manufacturing industry will be robotics and robots. Clearly, they are capable of doing a lot of the ordinary routine work that people working in factories do now. They're being introduced in almost every country in the world, almost with the exception of Britain. They will have an impact, certainly on some of the skilled trades like welders, that will decimate that particular trade. But then it's never been the most interesting job. And if robots just do the drudgery type jobs, then providing we have the rest of our system geared to the people being either unemployed or working less time, they must again be a very good thing.
We are now beginning to see real robots working in industry. And I think there's going to be a mass market for robots in the 1980s. You look at the robot welding machines, for example, you compare the rate at which a car body gets welded in the Toyota factory in Japan with the rate at which it gets welded in the typical factory in Britain. And the difference is quite phenomenal. And you've got the mail boy, the robot mail boy in Citibank over here delivering the mail, wandering its way down the corridors. And you've got the robots in the nuclear power stations. So there is quite a bit of use of robots now, but nevertheless, the technology of the instrumentation, the sensors, the visual perception, these technologies have got to get much better before we can build really versatile robots.
Of course, there is a kind of fear or a hope that robots will eventually be able to do all the manual work and even all the uninteresting clerical work that people do. So there is a possibility that the amount of work that men will have to do on the average may be reduced to an hour a week, for example. This is very pleasant if only we know how to use our leisure time, but at the same time it is also dangerous, I think. We don't know whether we'll be able to use our leisure time wisely. We don't know whether the machines that control the robots might find that humans are dispensable.
Just as the major economic activity of the agrarian era was to produce food, the major activity of the mechanical era was to produce manufactured goods. The major economic activity is going to be to fulfill psychic needs, and we will create a much more humanistic society because basically all the hard work that needed to be done to keep our bodies alive will be done by the robots and the machines. The difficulty is knowing how we can best get from here to there. As a biologist, I've often wondered if there was a period in this part of the universe when life didn't exist, and it's only about 3 billion years old. Is it the ultimate in the evolution of the universe, or may something follow it? And if something does follow it, what would it be? And my intuition tells me it would be intelligence, as different from life as life is from inanimate matter.
I mentioned the notion of an ultra-intelligent machine, and I suppose I should define it. It is a machine which can perform the intellectual activity of any man as well as any man. One effect of ultra-intelligent machines, in my opinion, would be very rapid advances in medicine. The cure of cancer, you might say, how can a machine carry out experiments? Well, of course, the machine doesn't have to carry out experiments. It can say what experiments ought to be done. It can analyze all the data. It can take it all in. The ordinary man simply cannot possibly take in all the research that's being done on cancer. For example, a child, say, age 10 now, in 50 years' time, will be much healthier if there are advances in science and in medical science and in nutrition than a man of 60 is, the average man of 60 is now. And the advances in medicine in 50 years, even without the ultra-intelligent machine, may be so great that his expectation of life would already be decades more than they are now. But that puts him into almost a century ahead. A century of scientific medical advances by the UIM should presumably easily extend his life, shall we say, another 50 years, and so on. I mean, there's really no reason why that person should ever die except by accident, as far as I can see.
The introduction and development of artificial intelligence and ultimately ultra-intelligence I think, first of all, is going to cause a very negative reaction among a large sector of the population for the very reasons that the idea that the Earth was not the center of the universe or that humans were descended from other primates generated that kind of reaction. We like to think that we are a very, very unique creature. Education is going to be the #1 industry of the next century. There's no question in my mind of that. Of course, I mean by education not merely schools and universities. I mean television. I mean any group of people that make a living transmitting information from one group to another group. That's education. Now, education is going to be the #1 industry because it's so desperately needed in society, but also because it becomes relatively cheap. Firstly, the present trends are very clear already. Since 1975, the global budget for education has exceeded the global military budget, for example. We're going to see a continued expansion of that, but with the cheap information devices, both in terms of storage and retrieval, we're going to see a whole new kind of education, and it'll be really fun.
We have the capability now to get superlative education into the home. We have the ability to create all manner of new job opportunities. You've got these millions of people converging on Manhattan every day in those awful trains. Now, I used to live 50 miles away from here and then commuted for an hour and a half and then for an hour and a half back each evening. Now, what a waste of life that is. And there's simply no need. You look at these big skyscrapers here, big insurance companies, and what do people do when they come to those buildings? Well, they use the telephone, they talk to people, they use typewriters, they hold meetings. In fact, absolutely everything they could do in their little village 100 miles away, providing that the office which they walk to or bicycle to in that village has got a satellite antenna on the roof or an appropriate high-capacity link of the type that we're now building.
One of the advantages of computers, especially computers in the home, is simply for education. If it is easy and playful, so to speak, to acquire information by pressing buttons, that would encourage many children, especially those who'd already been using the computer for playing games, to acquire information from a central information store. If the computer has a reasonable degree of intelligence so that it can answer questions as well as ask them, then of course you have something in the nature of a teacher which the child would have good rapport towards. Some children, I think, are hard to educate simply because they cannot get rapport with an adult.
The home environment will be unprecedented in the information. It'll make owning books or an encyclopedia as outdated as now owning a Victorian slate to scratch on. That rich information environment will be a source of great stimulation and of great joy. However, we must recognize that the transition period is going to be very difficult. The new coin of power is information. During the agrarian era, power resided in ownership of land. During the mechanical era, highlighted by the Industrial Revolution, of course, it was capital and money. Now it's information. But there's some very interesting features of information. For one thing, the old equations don't hold. If I give you half the land, I've got half left. If I give you half my money, I've got half left. But if I give you half my information, I still have the information left. So it creates all kinds of new economic interactions, certainly interactions which I think will tend to favor cooperation.
Well, one of the great fears that people have about the spread of computers and the spread of advanced telecommunications is that it could be a tool which enormously aids a totalitarian government or a dictator. You can just imagine the appalling things that a Hitler could do with the technology which we have today. And so this is one of the very real fears. Now, totalitarian societies tend to be scared of too much communications. And if you look at the totalitarian societies, you find that most of the communications goes from the center to the periphery in the society. And the periphery doesn't have much lateral communications. In fact, at the beginning of this decade, I believe it was true that the number of telephones per person in Russia was less than the number of telephones per person in Fiji.
I think that the importance of communication is shown rather dramatically by the possibility of the leaders of governments, especially, being able to become friends with the leaders of other governments. They could communicate so well, assuming that, for example, that mechanical translation was available, and so immediately, that they might become as friendly with the leader of another government as they were with the people in their own country, rather like the way that political marriages were arranged over the course of history.
There is perhaps, strangely, one kind of sunny ray on the horizon, and that is the European Economic Community, of which I am not noted to be the most fervent supporter. But the Commission themselves have actually realized there is a problem, and they are producing documents to try and work out what the future will be for Europe, not based on the traditional patterns, not based on the traditional political patterns, not based on the traditional heavy industries, but based on a new form of industry, a new form of knowledge-based industry. One of the real problems that is facing the world today is that the rich nations are getting richer, the poor nations are getting poorer, and there has been no appreciable transfer of technology from one country, developed country, to an underdeveloped country. Now, one of the interesting things with this particular technology is that it's cheap. Where before, to transfer technology, that developing country would have to spend literally billions of pounds to get it in, you've suddenly got a technology where it can be bought for a trifle, comparatively. I mean, computers which cost £1 million are now costing thousands, even hundreds. Now, that means it's available at the sort of prices that developing countries can afford.
And I think it would be a great shame if the Third World tried to copy the West and build the same highways and the same skyscrapers in the cities, and to some extent they are doing that now. And what they should be doing is skipping generations of Western technology and inventing how telecommunications can change the educational system and change the job patterns. And they shouldn't necessarily be allowing the people to move from the villages into the cities where it's so difficult to house them, cities like Lima. Instead, they should be building the communication structure which can give those people a good life in their villages rather than having them move to the cities.
At the moment, the real gap is the information gap. Third world countries, kids grow up without any experience how to handle manual mechanical devices, how to do nuts and bolts, for example. And more importantly, no sense of how you organize things. The traditional patterns of organization along extended family lines is not adequate for a highly productive society. So it is this organizational information where the new information technology can be so helpful, both in helping to actually organize things and in education, rather than building a whole series of schoolhouses to be staffed often with third-rate teachers because that's all they're able to obtain. You put a mini computer and a television set in every hut. I mean, that's the extreme. But the thing gets cheap enough that you can do it. And you teach everybody not only how to read and write, about farming techniques, about nutrition, about cooking, whatever you want. And you get an enormously effective information transfer system. And that's where I think the great hope lies.
This technology sharpens our conflicts. What it really means is we can approach things in just two ways. We can either say we carry on as we are at the moment with all our social, economic and political institutions and use the technology. And to my mind, all that will mean is a massive unemployment, a massive misery, a massive fear, and you will have to run that society at bayonet point. There is no other way. There is an alternative. The alternative is to take a humane way out, to negotiate, to treat the unemployed, if there are unemployed, as human beings, to actually reduce the amount of work and increase the amount of leisure, to give a better life for us, our children and our grandchildren, by actually redistributing the fruits of this technology. Now, if we take that way, it's got to be a far, far better world.
Basically, I'm quite optimistic. And what I see happening now in the communicative era is the end of those other two dreaded horsemen of the apocalypse, war and strife. The mechanical era, the Industrial Revolution, eliminated pestilence and famine. War and strife will also be eliminated in this era as the primary motivation for war, which is always the extension of resources necessitated by enlarging population, as that problem is solved through the enormous productivity that will be generated by the new technology.
A man lives about 1 billion seconds. He can only take in at the most a sentence per second. So that's a billion sentences. That is far less than the information available in the Library of Congress, for example. Whereas within 10 years, that size of information will probably be available to an ultra-intelligent machine. So simply on grounds of memory alone and access to that memory, the machine will have the advantage over a man.
I see us beginning to emerge into a society which is not a static utopia, but rather a society in which we define in a scientific manner what it means to be human. What are human requirements? How should we structure society to maximize the options and the needs of all individuals? And from there, we may begin to do what humanity may well have been destined, which is to have life spread beyond this planet out into space.
You know, we've embarked on a wild adventure. We really have. And nobody knows where all of this is going to lead. And in a sense, nobody's in control. In a sense, the technology is leading us, and we don't know where it's leading us. All that we can sensibly speculate about today is what's going to happen in the next 10 or 15 years. But for goodness sake, where on earth is it going to be by the time we are old, or by the time our children are old? I've got a 3-year-old daughter, and I think, you know, what's it going to be like when she's my age? And I really believe we've got the capability today to build a much better world for her than people are living in today.
Whether we find these views encouraging or disheartening, one fundamental fact has to be faced. Although the air is thick with debate, with the microprocessor firmly at the center of the stage, the debate itself is really already pointless. Today, our world is depending more and more on computer technology, and for some time now, we've been moving down a path from which there's no turning back. Dr. Evans believed that the microprocessor is destined to benefit each one of us without exception, and that inevitably we will have to move through a period of great social unrest in order to achieve it. In his book, he points out that the Victorian machine age surged into motion and ran its course before most people were aware of what had happened. But now we at least have some foresight, the ability to contemplate, though not for long, the amazing changes that mankind is about to force upon itself.